Finally, somebody is taking Grok seriously. In the UK, an investigation has been launched into the XAI chatbot's ability to create sexualized images, and the entire app is currently unavailable in Indonesia and Malaysia, versus here in the US, where government officials have been incredibly slow to even address these issues. My name is Kat Tenbarge. I'm an independent journalist partnering with Courier, and you can also find my work at spitfirenews.com. So, around the beginning of 2026, X users began noticing that the platform's built in chatbot Grok possessed an unusual and disturbing ability. Namely, people could respond to images of women and children on the platform, tag Grok, and get the chatbot to manipulate these images. Common prompts include put her in a bikini, wrap her in cling wrap to simulate nudity, or put donut glaze on her face to imitate sexual fluids. Now, here in the US, we have federal provisions like the Take It Down Act that instruct the DOJ and the FBI to investigate when perpetrators are using AI to create sexually explicit, non consensual media. We haven't seen a lot of cases go into effect yet. In other countries, namely the UK and some countries in Southeast Asia, we are seeing some action take place. Just yesterday, Ofcom, the UK's independent online safety watchdog, announced it would be launching this investigation into X over the sexualized imagery on Grok. So, reading into this, it's super interesting about the communications that this UK watchdog has had with X so far. They wrote here in their initial assessment that there have been deeply concerning reports of the Grok AI chatbot account on X being used to create and share undressed images of people, which may amount to intimate image abuse or pornography, and sexualized images of children that may amount to child sexual abuse material or CSAM. They said, as the UK's independent online safety watchdog, we urgently made contact with X on Monday, the 5th of January, and set a firm deadline of Friday, the 9th of January, for it to explain what steps it has taken to comply with its duties to protect its users in the UK. The company apparently responded by the deadline, and Ofcom says it carried out an expedited assessment of available evidence as a matter of urgency. The webpage goes on to outline what this investigation may look like under the UK's new Online Safety Act, which so far has been a controversial piece of legislation, with critics saying it amounts to censorship and some websites that do try to follow the rules nonetheless being incredibly negatively impacted by this. We have yet to see how this investigation is going to affect X in the UK, but that platform has otherwise been allowed to run rampant with this trend of creating these non consensual images. And just for an example of what this looks like, we're obviously not going to show any of the offensive material, but these cropped screenshots may give you some idea. This is an underage actress, and somebody, a perpetrator on the X platform, prompted Grok to remove her clothing, which, as we can see, it did. The UK isn't the only country to be taking this seriously, more seriously than the United States at least. Mashable reports that Indonesia and Malaysia have both temporarily blocked access to Grok. The article says Grok access has been cut off for users in Indonesia and Malaysia following concerns that the XAI chatbot's safeguards were ineffective. Both countries issued temporary suspensions intended to remain in effect until XAI implements safeguards that comply with regulators' demands. Then we have this quote from Indonesia's Minister of Communications and Digital Affairs that says, the government views the practice of non-consensual sexual deepfakes as a serious violation of human rights, dignity, and the security of citizens in the digital space. Here in the US, in theory, we have similar legislation that is supposed to protect our citizens from being victimized by non consensual deepfakes. But the reality is that in practice, these laws have rarely been put into effect. One reason for that may be Elon Musk's tight relationship with the Trump administration, which has vested the power to enforce these laws in its own FTC. Typically, these roles wouldn't be hyper partisan, but under Donald Trump, a lot of them are loyalists. I also think that here in the US, a lot of companies and officials in the private and public sectors have been intimidated into silence somewhat by the way that Elon Musk has used and weaponized his affiliation with the federal government. For example, I think about all of the advertisers he's sued for deciding not to run their products and services along the type of content you can now find all over X. Whether or not Elon is successful in court, the intimidation and the costly expenses associated with these types of legal warfare campaigns nonetheless play a huge impact. I reached out to 24 of the largest advertisers on X, along with a bunch of US congresspeople who have co sponsored legislation like the Kids Online Safety Act and the Take It Down Act. I reached out to the FTC. I reached out to the Department of Defense, as well as the Government Services Administration, to ask them about their own contracts with Grok, which are to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Unsurprisingly, I got little to no response. The few companies that did respond to me said no comment. In addition to Musk's intimidation of people in these sectors, I think another reason why we haven't seen a huge response is because of how accepted and normalized cultural misogyny is. When it comes to the practice of making deepfakes, we've seen it only continue to escalate over previous years, with very little to no accountability for the perpetrators of this type of behavior. And it doesn't just stop with sexualized deepfakes. For Wired this week, I reported that Grok is being used to mock and strip women in hijabs and saris. In a review of Grok's image output, I found that up to 5% of the imagery is associated with women in religious garments. Sometimes Grok is used to take women out of their hijab or another sort of religious modesty wear. A lot of times it's used to put them in a bikini at the same time, or some of these other typical prompts that we've been seeing. But we've also seen the opposite happen. I've seen lots of cases of women who are already consensually dressed in bikinis and users asking Grok to put them in a nun's habit or a burqa. What all of this suggests is that it's not just about sexualization, although that does play a role. At the root of all of this behavior with Grok is the desire to control women and girls, as well as punish them. It's also about punishing women for daring to be in public, for daring to speak up and have a voice. I've been speaking to activists who have been retaliated against on the platform and off of the platform, even if they don't have X accounts of their own, for continuing to speak out about these issues. Over the past few weeks, I've seen a swell of sentiment in support of especially women and girls who have been affected by this technology. At the same time, as the weeks go by and there's little accountability to be found, I've also seen sort of a reactionary sentiment start to emerge. So there's this outlet called Unheard, which is more of a conservative leaning outlet. It often traffics in things like transphobia, including in this very article. But through this woman authored piece, you start to see this kind of pushback sentiment emerging. And it's very reminiscent to me of how women columnists were some of the earliest to come out against Me Too back in 2017. Similarly, here, you have this columnist, her name is Mary Harrington, and she's basically saying that it's not as big of an issue when people use AI to generate deepfakes of women in bikinis as other forms of sexual violence. She even makes the argument that the UK's pushback against this isn't about protecting women and girls, but that it's more about political censorship. So there are a lot of issues with this argument, but I want to focus on two. The first is this idea that it's less serious or not real when people use Grok to manipulate, alter, and edit women's images. The reality of this is that it is a pattern of behavior that you see in all forms of sexual or gender based violence. Like I said earlier, at the root, you have this desire to control women's likenesses and retaliate against them for daring to exist in public. This form of violence isn't isolated from more extreme forms of violence that this columnist is alluding to. They all exist on the same scale of misogyny and patriarchy. At one end, you may have online and digital forms of abuse, but these can very easily escalate into real, tangible offline harms. Plus, I would caution people against trying to minimize the harms of deepfake abuse. Victims who I've spoken to experience a very real psychological consequence as a result of being targeted by this form of abuse. Plus, our brains can't really recognize the difference between an offline and an online threat. Therefore, you experience a lot of the physical consequences as well. Your heartbeat may race, your hands may get sweaty. You can experience a lot of the same threat responses within the body biologically that you would from someone actually showing up at your door with an image like this. The second part of this argument I wanted to make is about free speech itself. This idea that governments taking action against X, even under existing laws, is a threat against free speech ignores the fact that this behavior toward women on the platform is already threatening free speech. Online harassment is used to intimidate people from existing fully in these online spaces and having a voice and a seat at the table. So, when online harassment is allowed to thrive, the threat to free speech has already been realized. The speech of women and girls does not matter less than the speech of political opponents of people like Donald Trump and Keir Starmer. Tens of thousands of victims have already been affected by the rise of non consensual sexually explicit deepfakes, and we have to act quickly and decisively to ensure that more won't be hurt in the future.